Welcome, everyone, to our panel, Psychological Change in Intergroup Conflict. My name is Oliver FINK. I'll be guiding us through this session. One of the strengths of the Basel Peace Forum is to look at peace building from very different perspectives and with different approaches. Our topic, understanding how internal changes relate to intergroup conflict, are at the heart of many peace building and conflict transformation activities. So I'm delighted that we have this panel, including several thought leaders in their respective fields. We start with Dr. Eran Halperin. He's a professor in the Department of Psychology at the Hebrew University Jerusalem, and he's also the head and founder of the Accord Center for Social Change. He'll be giving us an introduction into the topic of psychological change, or how we call it, psychological interventions.
Thank you very much, Oliver. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm happy to be in this forum, and I'm happy to introduce our great and interesting panel. I will say, as you said, we study intergroup conflicts, the psychological aspects of intergroup conflicts, and we're coming from Israel, which means that naturally we study mainly psychological interventions within the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I want to start with a small paradox. Israel is approaching elections, national elections, very, very soon. Actually, it's our fourth elections in 1 year. But one very interesting thing that is happening during these election campaigns or before these coming elections is that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is not even discussed within the public discourse or within the campaigns of the different parties. So think about this paradox. The most important aspect or the most important issue, the thing that is the most powerful, the most central, the most relevant to Israelis and Palestinians alike, is not part of the public discourse before the next or the coming Israeli election. And this is mainly because no one really believes that peace is possible or that conflict resolution is possible. Neither Israelis nor Palestinians believe that it can happen in the generations to come. And the big paradox here is that, when we do public opinion surveys among both Israelis and Palestinians, we've been doing public opinion surveys again and again and again, we see that there is a huge majority of both Israelis and Palestinians who support the political compromises that are required in order to promote peace. So people on both sides, more than 2/3 of the people on both sides, support the political compromises that are necessary in order to promote peace, but we don't even discuss peace. We don't believe that peace is possible. We don't think that we can achieve peace in the next generation. And we social psychologists, of course, we're a little bit biased about that, but as social psychologists, we believe the reason for this gap or for this paradox is because of what we call psychological barriers. So it's not the problem. What prevents us from moving towards peace is not disagreements about the real issues, the political issues, but psychological factors that simply prevent people from identifying opportunity. And therefore, what we do, and many social psychologists in recent years, and you're going to see some of them in this panel, is to try and move from a more descriptive approach, which means, to try and understand the psychological processes involved in these kind of long-term conflicts or in peace processes, to a much more interventionist approach, to ask ourselves, what can we do as psychologists in order to help people address these psychological barriers? So if it's not the political or the ideological issues that prevent us from moving forward, it's probably the psychological issues or the psychological barriers that do that. And what we try to do in our research is to try and identify ways to address these psychological barriers. Now, we have several assumptions on the basis of our research, and they're going to be, you're going to hear about them in many of the presentations that you're going to hear in this panel, but I will just mention them very, very briefly. The first assumption is that, at least when it comes to democratic societies, but also in other societies, public opinion matters. Public opinion matters in order to promote peace. The second assumption is that when you try to mobilize people to support peace or to support compromises that are required for peace, telling them or trying to convince them by simply offering or introducing counter arguments, arguments that go against their beliefs, simply doesn't work. In most cases, people will become even more defensive in their prior position, and they will not change their mind. The third assumption is that the classic ways of trying to move or to change people's opinions, like bringing people together in a contact setting or dialogue setting, trying to convince people to take the perspective of the other group in the conflict, these things or these strategies have many, many, many limitations. So what we try to do, and you're going to hear about it in the following three presentations, is to offer much more sophisticated evidence and theory-based perspective that can help us mobilize people to support peace. And what you're going to hear now are three different strategies that were tested in experimental settings in our lab and in different areas around the world that were proved to be successful in mobilizing people's attitudes, emotions, and motivations when it comes to peace processes and compromises. The last thing that I would say is that what you're going to hear today is mostly evidence from the lab or research in field work that is done outside of the lab. Whereas the big challenge that we have, and we try to address this challenge, is to bridge the gap between these scientific knowledge and findings that you're going to hear about today and the actual work that is done on the ground. And again, our assumption is that many, many leaders, NGOs, and entrepreneurs that are trying to mobilize public opinion in this area are using their intuition. And intuition is great, but in this case, where people are so heavily entrenched in their positions, it's simply not enough. So what we want to do is to bridge the gap between science and the actual work on the ground. And I think that what you're going to hear today will at least give you some ideas about what can be done and how it can be done in order to mobilize public opinion. So I'll thank you at this point, and I'll move back to Oliver.
Thank you very much, Eran, for this introduction. Our first researcher is Deborah Shulman. She's pursuing her PhD in the psychology of intergroup conflict and reconciliation lab at the Hebrew University Jerusalem, and she's also affiliated with the University of Jena. She'll be talking about analogies in conflict.
Hi, thanks Oliver for the introduction. And today I'm presenting work on an analogy-based intervention that we developed and tested in order to try to increase acknowledgement of in-group transgressions in the context of intergroup conflict. So in the context of conflict, groups do really bad things to those on the other side, like violent, harmful actions. And acknowledging the immorality of in-group committed harms is something that is very threatening for people in the context of these conflicts. Even if you weren't a soldier committing these atrocities to those on the other side, just the fact that your group has done these harmful actions is very threatening to hear about. And this is because people want to see their group in a moral light, because their group reflects on themselves. And people therefore judge their group they use different moral standards to judge their own group's behavior, not the same objective moral standards they use to judge behavior in other contexts. And people rarely experience aversive emotions such as guilt and shame towards the behavior of their group. And all this leads to a kind of moral hypocrisy where people are not judging the transgressions and harmful behavior of their group, in the way we might expect, and they're using these lenient standards when they think about what their group is doing to those on the other side. And this leads to the important question: how can we increase acknowledgement of in-group harm doing amongst in-group members who would prefer to downplay and avoid this information? So to answer this question, I'm going to give you an example of how we developed this intervention from research done mainly in philosophy, and we'll see soon how it applies to our context. So this is the trolley scenario, and there's a train coming towards 5 people. And this is the idea that I'm showing this is to show that our moral judgments are affected by the judgments we make prior to our other judgments. So there's a train coming, and it's going to kill these 5 people. And this man has a choice to pull a lever, divert the train, kill this one person, but save these 5 people. And most people think this is a morally acceptable action because you're saving 5 and only killing 1. And then there's a similar, almost analogous example of the bridge and a man on the bridge. And this time, this man doesn't have a lever, but he has a choice to push the big man off the bridge, killing 1 and saving 5. So arguably, these are very similar scenarios, but most people think this is morally wrong. And he's a bigger man. That's why he can't throw himself off, because this big man is going to have enough mass to block the train. So when these are asked sequentially, and people are first asked, is it okay to push the man? Most people say no. And then when they're asked, well, is it okay to pull the lever? We find more people saying, well, this is actually also morally wrong, showing that our moral judgments are shaped by our prior moral judgments and the principles that the other scenario evokes. So taking this to the context of intergroup conflict, we said already that most people look at their in-group committed harm doing and regard it as morally acceptable because we're motivated to see our group's actions as acceptable. But if we were to see similar analogous scenarios and removed context where a group is not the perpetrator, we're probably going to see a lot of harmful actions that are committed during wars as wrong. So if we first consider the removed case and we see that as wrong, are we going to also see similar in-group behaviours as wrong as well? And this was their thinking behind the intervention. And actually people use this kind of intervention, maybe without all that thinking, but in the real world. For example, people are comparing South Africa to Israel. And if you think you should boycott South Africa, then you should probably also boycott Israel, for example. Or if you think the Vietnam war was wrong, you should probably also think the Iraq war, which has led to more loss of lives, was wrong as well. So people use this, but there isn't really psychological studies testing whether this type of intervention is effective. So that is what we developed, and we did it in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we looked at the case of home demolition. And home demolition is a type of collective punishment, and it's a policy that Israel sometimes uses in response to Palestinian terrorism, especially suicide terrorism, because there's no perpetrator to punish because the perpetrator has been killed. So the idea is you punish the family of the terrorist, and it's collective punishment because you're punishing someone that didn't do anything wrong as a family member, and it's generally seen as wrong. It's against international law, but some people regard it as a deterrent. And maybe it's not surprising because of what we've discussed so far that people tend to defend their in-group harm doing, that 80% of the Jewish Israeli public tend to support this action. But we wondered if, because collective punishment is generally seen as a universal, internationally morally wrong thing, if Jewish Israelis thought of collective punishment in another context before thinking about collective punishment towards Palestinians, would they then be more likely to see that as wrong? So in our experiments, we created it was a fictional case of collective punishment in Sri Lanka, where the authorities detained terrorist relatives. So again, relatives being punished for the crimes that they didn't commit. So in one condition, people only read about in-group, like the home demolition, Israel demolishing homes of Palestinian families. And then the other condition, they first were exposed to this analogy about about collective punishment in Sri Lanka. And interestingly, everyone thought this was wrong. There wasn't much, that wasn't really debated. Most people thought that collective punishment in Sri Lanka was wrong. And we hypothesized that considering that case first would lead people towards acknowledging the in-group wrongdoing. And indeed, we found that in our study. We found that people who were exposed to this Sri Lankan analogy saw in-group committed harm doing as more wrong, and they also felt more guilt and shame regarding the harm doing. And then we wanted to understand a little bit about the psychological process that's happening here, and were people motivated by consistency, and they said something was wrong, and therefore they just wanted to be consistent with their answer, or was there more of a learning process going on? So in another study, we tested what happened if the analogy was anticipated. Because if the analogy is anticipated, people could judge both cases more leniently. They have this opportunity to be consistent in their judgments by saying, it's okay that they did it there and it's okay they did it here. But if it's more that you actually learn something about your moral principles from the removed scenario, then we'd expect that even if the analogy was anticipated, people would still learn something and want to apply it even when judging their in-group transgressions. And indeed, we found that even when the analogy was anticipated, it was effective and led to more shame and guilt and more acknowledgement of the wrongness of the action, suggesting that even when people could have been consistent by saying both are wrong, they actually seem to gain something by being exposed to the analogy and then applying it. And we tested this idea in another study, and we saw that when people were exposed to the analogous case of wrongdoing, they adopted moral principles, they became more salient, the idea that it's wrong to punish family members for things that they haven't done. And with that principle in mind, they then applied it even to the case so that they're normally very motivated and defensive about, and said it's also more wrong in our case as well. So to sum up, our intervention suggested that drawing an analogy with a removed case of harm can lead people to see in-group harm as more wrong. And this is a real challenge, and this it shows a new kind of intervention that could address this challenge. We also understood a bit more about the mechanism. It seems that people really can learn something through learning or being exposed to information about conflict in different contexts. And we think there's a lot of questions here still to ask, and we're interested in researching. We want to know, when analogies are more effective, how long these effects last, when they actually might backfire in the real world. There's a lot to still ask, but we think these studies provide a really interesting first step. Thank you very much, and thank you to my supervisors, Michal Reifel-Tagar, Eran Halperin, and Thomas Kessler, and Noshori Ayal, who collaborated with me in this project.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for this interesting line of research. We come with our next speaker, Dr. Orly Idan, to the topic how language is used in intergroup conflict. Orly Idan is a psycholinguist and lecturer and senior research associate with the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya and also at the Martin Springer Center for Conflict Studies at Ben-Gurion University. And she'll presenting some of her work on linguistic cues.
Hello, everyone. This talk focuses on a subtle and simple intervention in which we're integrating language, emotions, and political conflict. The study was carried out by Professor Eran Halperin, Dr. Boaz Hameiri, and Dr. Michal Reifen-Tagar, and myself. So we are focusing in the current work on both psycholinguistic research on the power of language in shaping emotions, and not only emotions, on the power of language in shaping, molding, influencing our thought processes, our perceptions of reality, and on psychological research on the power of emotions in shaping policy preferences, exploring specifically an extremely subtle language difference in inducing change in anger and corresponding policy preference in the context of intergroup conflict. Acknowledging this central role of emotions in the context of intractable conflicts, and the central role played in particular by anger in shaping and motivating policy preferences in the context of intergroup conflict, it's important to reduce levels of anger because this may serve as a means towards conflict resolution. Compromises from the in-group side may cause anger, which may prevent these compromises from actually being undertaken. Therefore, the reduction of levels of anger is significant for establishing conciliatory, peaceful policies. Evidence from social cognitive, neuropsychological, and cross-cultural studies is consistent with the psychological constructionist view that language helps constitute emotion. Distinct linguistic forms automatically activate social meaning independent of their explicit semantic content. That means that form influences content, or in other words, the form may change the way we actually understand the meaning of a given word. When social meaning associated with a specific linguistic form overlaps with appraisals underlying specific emotions, the linguistic cue can evoke the corresponding emotion. Research shows that even the mere use of a distinct grammatical category, for example, adjective versus noun, can activate different construal, affecting judgment and behavioral preferences. So what we have here is language influencing judgment, which in turn influences behavior. Thus, the mere use of distinct wording can activate concept knowledge relevant to different emotional experiences. And based on all of this, we asked, what kind of linguistic cue, form, is likely to activate such construal that would overlap with the unique appraisals underlying the emotion of anger within the context of violent and intractable conflicts? We are focusing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as such, and we suggest that noun versus verb form in articulating intergroup policies might offer one such cue. There are two potential explanations for the difference between nouns and verbs. So first of all, we have stative versus agentic. The noun is stative, the noun is constant, whereas the verbs emphasize the agent, the person who is carrying out the action. Given that anger is driven largely by the appraisal that a specific actor is responsible for causing the wrongdoing at hand, we expected that policies articulated in noun versus verb form should reduce levels of anger. Additionally, a second explanation is abstract versus vivid. So nouns are associated or experienced as abstract, and they're associated with distance. That is, it's far away from me. As opposed to verbs, which describe processes and have been shown to stimulate the action simulation in the mind, so that when I'm using a verb, I can actually see myself carrying out the action. We set out to test the impact of noun versus verb in 3 separate studies. In the first study, we hypothesized that noun labels would reduce levels of in-group anger regarding the implementation of conciliatory policies in the context of the conflict, which correspondingly would increase support for conciliatory policies. We examined Jewish Israeli undergraduate students, and we asked them to indicate their level of agreement with 5 items reflecting conciliatory policies. Following that, we asked them to indicate the extent to which they experienced anger toward the state, toward the body that would implement these conciliatory policies. We, of course, measured political ideology, given the centrality of political ideology in this context. But first, we verified whether the participants did not differ in this regard across the 2 conditions, and of course, controlled for political ideology throughout the entire analyses, throughout the 3 studies, because we wanted to be able to say that should we find a difference, it is above and beyond political ideology. Let's look at these 5 conciliatory items. Let's focus specifically on one for this presentation. Look at the 3rd sentence here. The first group, or half of the participants, received, "I am for dividing Jerusalem within a permanent solution." This is in the verb form. Whereas in the noun form, the second half of the participants received, "I am for the division of Jerusalem." Now, in Hebrew, it has an even more distinct difference, the noun versus the verb form. Please note that semantically, there is absolutely no difference. What did we find? As predicted, when using the noun form, levels of anger toward the state were reduced. And when using the noun form, there was an increase in support for conciliatory policies. Based on this result, or on these results, we carried out study 2. And in study 2, we also examined anger towards the outgroup, anger towards the Palestinians in this case. So the in-group being the state, the outgroup, the Palestinians. And what did we find? In line with study 1, participants reported experiencing more anger towards the state in the verb condition and more anger towards the Palestinians in the verb condition. At the same time, again, based on the previous study, participants were more supportive of concessions in the noun condition. And so we moved on to the 3rd study. In this study, we added 2 additional variables. First of all, we added more emotions, not only anger, and also we examined retaliatory policies, that is, policies that are aggressive, that are militant, the opposite of conciliatory. And in line with the previous studies, participants reported experiencing more anger towards the state in the verb condition. Also, they experienced reporting more fear towards the Palestinians in the verb condition and higher levels of guilt toward the Palestinians in the verb condition. In line with the 2 previous studies, participants were significantly more supportive of concessions in the noun condition. As emotions and conflict are often highly correlated, an increase in one emotion is likely to lead to an increase in a similar or related emotion. To gauge the impact of the manipulation uniquely on each of the emotions, we created a measure of the residual of each one of these emotions. And reanalysis revealed that only anger towards the state was uniquely impacted by the noun-verb frame. Remember, this is in the context of conciliatory policies. And we can see that when we're talking about the retaliatory policies, the opposite effect happened. Participants in the noun condition reported significantly less support for retaliatory policies. So the noun had the exact same role, whether increasing support in conciliatory policies and decreasing support regarding retaliatory policies. We also carried out a reanalysis using the residualized measures of each emotion, and this revealed that only anger toward the Palestinians was uniquely impacted. So we had anger toward the state when we spoke about state-initiated policies, and we had the star of the show, anger toward the outgroup, when we were relating to Palestinian-initiated action. We can conclude regarding, obviously, adding a bulk of theoretical understanding in both psycholinguistic research and political psychology research. And we can definitely conclude that the mere use of a distinct grammatical form actually makes a significant difference. So the linguistic cue is subtle, but the difference in perception and emotional experience is significant. We will carry out further research in order to justify this excitement. And the applied relevance is just as important, if not more. It's important to say that in the current work, the intervention does not rely on people's motivation, okay? And also that it's of special importance considering how resistant to change people living in societies inflicted with violent conflict tend to be. And language is a simple tool to change this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Orly. As it happens sometimes in these panels, we're running a little bit behind, so we might have to shorten our Q&A session and discussion in the end. Still, feel free to send us questions if you're interested or contact the speakers directly. Because we want to take proper time for our last panelist and the fascinating topic of paradoxical thinking. Dr. Boaz Hameiri is senior lecturer in the Evans program in mediation and conflict management at Tel Aviv University. Hi, Boaz, up to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Oliver. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you for this opportunity to tell you a little bit about our research on paradoxical thinking for the past few years. Unfortunately, this time is virtual, but hopefully next time it will be in person. Eran, I think, set the stage very well, beginning talking about how most interventions try to promote change, conflict resolution, and attitude change in these contexts using usually inconsistent information. But as Eran said, in many cases, in these contexts, specifically the context of intergroup and sometimes prolonged and violent intractable conflicts, these beliefs and attitudes in these contexts are very strongly held. They're very highly cherished, and sometimes they are also called frozen, which means that using this type of information that tries to challenge these attitudes and beliefs, are usually, in most cases, is not successful, or at least in many cases. As an example for these intergroup beliefs and attitudes in these contexts of intractable conflicts, we can think of several examples. So these frozen attitudes in these contexts can be, for example, attitudes such as that we are moral while the other side is immoral, that we are the true victims while the other side just tries to harm us, that we only strive for peace while the other side is not a real partner for peace. Now, it's important to say that during conflict or during violence, these attitudes and beliefs are actually functional. They're adaptive because they help individuals to cope with the tremendous hardship that the conflict entails. But and this is important, when there's an actual opportunity for peace, these attitudes and beliefs become a barrier for conflict resolution because, as we said, they're frozen and lead to biased information processing. So a major challenge that we, practitioners and researchers, face is to unfreeze these barriers, to lead to openness to alternative information regarding the conflict, regarding the enemy, and regarding the in-group and its actions, much like what Deborah said in her talk. So, as Eran said, there were quite a bit different psychological interventions that were developed in order to try to do that, right? In order to try to promote better intergroup relations in context of intergroup conflict. And most of these interventions were based on what can be called as the inconsistency principle, which is to try to change attitudes and beliefs of individuals by creating inconsistency between the message that is conveyed or the information that is conveyed in the message and the held beliefs and attitudes of message recipients. And this should lead to tension or dissonance, something along these lines, and this should eventually lead to attitude change. And although these interventions were successful under certain conditions and certain contexts, when they are applied in the context of intractable conflict, of violent and prolonged conflict, in many cases, they are less effective because, as we said, people resist these attempts, these persuasive attempts to try to change their attitudes, and because they want to maintain their cherished worldviews, their conflict-supporting beliefs and attitudes. So as a consequence, these interventions usually convince those who had more motivation to change to begin with, those who were more open to this alternative information to begin with. So in trying to circumvent this limitation, we developed the paradoxical thinking approach or intervention. So in a nutshell, differently than most interventions that attempt, as we said, to try to persuade individuals using inconsistent information, paradoxical thinking is actually the attempt to change people's attitudes using messages that are consistent with their held beliefs and attitudes, but are provided in an amplified, exaggerated, or even an absurd manner. And we argue that this should get individuals to realize the absurdity in their held beliefs and attitudes or the current situation. It is largely based on the classic debating technique reductio ad absurdum, as well as other clinical psychological techniques and treatments. I won't have time to go into today, unfortunately. And we found, and this is important, we found this intervention to be effective in promoting unfreezing of attitudes and beliefs and in promoting more positive intergroup attitudes, especially among the more resistant individuals or those who were more adamant in their held beliefs and attitudes. And we also examined this approach mostly in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict context, but this approach was also examined in other contexts, such as Germans' attitudes towards Muslim asylum seekers, as an example. So as just one example, based on the paradoxical thinking principles, we designed and examined a paradoxical thinking campaign we named The Conflict. This campaign included several YouTube video clips expressing ideas that were consistent with the widely shared conflict-supporting societal belief system that is widely shared among many Jewish Israelis, but it provided these messages in an amplified, exaggerated, or even an absurd manner. So, for example, the video I'll show you next deals with a very prominent Israeli perception that the Israeli army is the most small army in the world, and this is obviously without a doubt, and this is also in spite of the very complicated conflict reality. But instead of tackling this issue with inconsistent information, as perhaps other interventions would have done, trying to persuade individuals that perhaps the Israeli army is not so moral, perhaps give different examples, etc., the video doesn't do that. It actually doesn't try to refute Israelis' belief in morality, but it actually amplifies it, it exaggerates it, and it extrapolates from it an absurd conclusion. Okay, so after we found this campaign to be effective in an online field study that, again, I don't have time to talk about today, but I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has one. In the study I want to present to you today, we wanted to test the effectiveness of this intervention, this campaign, as a real-world intervention. So what we've done is we took these original videos and we created a multi-channel campaign based on them. And this included three channels over the course of 6 weeks. So first we had an online campaign directed at the city residents, city that we targeted, that I'll say a few words about in a minute, using the city residents' IP addresses. And we had online banners and YouTube video commercials, such as the one we just watched. We had billboard posters in 20 different locations all over the city for approximately a week and a half. And in approximately 3 weeks, we handed out to passers-by in the city center several hundreds of the conflict campaigns, T-shirts and balloons, and something around 4,000 brochures. To assess the intervention's effectiveness, we devised a field study that had 2 measurements before and after the intervention. We sampled participants from this city in the center of Israel, Givat Shmuel, as a paradoxical thinking condition. And this city, is important to note, is mostly religious and right-winged, or in other words, more hawkish with regards to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which made it a more interesting case study for us, if you will. And as our control condition, we sampled participants from the surrounding area around this targeted city. So let's move to the results. We examined participants' adherence to conflict-supporting attitudes across time. So these include, for example, the belief that the Palestinians are responsible for the continuation of the conflict, that Israel is the real victim of the conflict, that the Israeli army is the most small army in the world, beliefs that we already discussed. And what we found is that was that in the control condition, levels of adherence remained constant across time, from before to after the intervention, which makes sense because they were not exposed to this intervention. Whereas in the paradoxical thinking condition, you can see a significant decrease in adherence in conflict-supporting beliefs across time, but only for the more rightist participants, again, those who are more hawkish with regards to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, who tend to be more adamant in their conflict related beliefs and attitudes. And we found similar results when we examined other support for policies, measurements, and measurements along these lines. I won't go into that because we are running out of time, so I'll just conclude by saying that how to change people's attitudes in order to promote constructive social change in general and conflict resolution in particular has intrigued social scientists for decades now. Most of these approaches, as Eran started from, were based on this inconsistency principle, right, to try to persuade people using inconsistent information. This can create change, but when applied in context of violent and prolonged conflicts, this faces severe challenges or severe barriers that can hinder change. And so it is mostly effective with the more dovish individuals in these contexts, individuals who are more willing to be exposed to this information to begin with. And so the work on paradoxical thinking with the study I present to you today as just one example provides strong evidence that paradoxical thinking is applicable in this difficult context. And it's also effective in leading to unfreezing and attitude change with those who are more adamant in their views, who are less open to peace-promoting interventions in general. And we hope that this can be applied in different conflictual contexts around the world and in the Middle East. And with that, I'd just like to end my collaborators, the funding agencies, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Boaz. Unfortunately, we are pretty much out of time, so we won't have time for the Q&A session. I encourage you to contact the panelists directly. There's a lot of interesting aspects to unpack more and talk about. We showed you an overview and some concrete examples how social psychology can contribute to peace building and conflict transformation. I hope that was interesting and hopefully also challenging, and you're looking forward to apply these insights in your lines of work. Again, if you have questions, contact us. And thank you very much to my dear colleagues and panelists. Thanks a lot.